Zuri stood at her bedroom window, watching the last strand of sunset light disappear over the horizon. There was a quiet and ominous silence in the air, and tension was growing inside her. Everything seemed familiar in the house. Shadows slowly slid across the floor, and the evening coolness penetrated through the open windows, refreshing the heated walls. But Zuri knew, today everything will change. Everything has to change. She was no longer the one who dutifully waited for her husband every evening, and not the one who humbly endured his cold looks and indifference. Today she made up her mind. Deep inside her, feelings had been bubbling for a long time, a mixture of discontent, anger, and disappointment. It all finally spilled out like a river bursting its banks. Zuri knew it was wrong. She knew that what she was about to do would change her life forever. But no matter how hard she tried to stop herself, something inside was pushing her to take this step. She had waited too long for Jabari to change, that at least one day he would look at her the way he used to, with warmth and admiration. But all she had seen in his eyes in recent years was indifference. She could no longer be his faceless shadow, his dead figure standing in the background of his successful life. A shadow flickered in the depths of the courtyard, and Zuri's heart stopped for a moment. She knew who it was. His footsteps were quiet but confident, like a predator that knows exactly where its prey is. Lume, her secret lover, the one who had long occupied an empty place in her heart, appeared in sight, and his silhouette against the crimson sky resembled the heroes of ancient myths, just as strong and fearless. He was completely different, wild, unbridled, his eyes burning with desire and passion. Zuri felt alive with him. Lumu was the one who filled her boring and monotonous life with bright colors. His every look, every gesture seemed to bring her back to herself, to the woman she had once been, before she became Jabari's wife. But the price for this feeling was prohibitively high, and she knew it. Lumu entered the house through the back door, as always. He moved confidently, but cautiously, as if calling for silence all around. In his presence, Zuri felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement every time. She watched him walk down the hallway. His dark eyes met hers, and in that one moment, 1,000 unspoken words flew between them. He didn't need greetings or preliminary explanations. They both knew why he had come, and they were both aware of the risks that each of their meetings entailed. But this only fueled the fire of their attraction. Lumu came closer, and Zuri felt his breath on her skin, as his presence penetrated every corner of her mind, erasing everything except this moment.
Do you still want this?
His voice was low but penetrating, as if it contained the answer to all the questions. Zuri closed her eyes for a moment. She had no words to express what she felt. It was more than a desire. It was a need that she couldn't resist, despite all the consequences. She knew Jabari would be back soon, but the thought of it only made her want to take the last.
Yes,
She whispered, her voice trembling with tension. More than ever, Lumu did not wait for any further explanation. He was a man of action, not words. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. Their lips met with a force that came not only from physical attraction, but also from the pain and thirst that they both carried within themselves. There was more than passion in those kisses. It was their way of escaping from reality. At least for a few moments, Zuri felt the world around her begin to disappear. All the problems, all the fears, even the future, all this receded into the background. All that mattered now was Luma and the feelings he aroused in her. She could feel his hands sliding over her body, his touch burning, as if he were not just a man, but a flame that she herself had caused. She knew this was the end. Not their meetings, not their secret relationship, but the end of the life she knew. Jabari was a strict and insightful man. He couldn't help but feel her betrayal. Zuri imagined how one day he would return home ahead of time, find them, and what would happen then. Yet in his eyes, she was already a traitor, even if he never found out the truth. His indifference made her invisible to him, as if she had long been an empty place in his world. But none of that mattered now. Lumu was here, and he was real. There was that very reality in his touch that awakened her, made her feel life and passion. She ran her fingers over his shoulders, feeling the hard muscles beneath the thin fabric of his clothes. Every moment with him, was worth its weight in gold, and every kiss was like a challenge to fate. Suddenly, Lumu stopped. His hands froze on her body, and he whispered softly.
We don't have to do this anymore, Zuri.
She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. He looked at her with regret and anxiety, as if something had broken in him.
That's not what I want.
He continued, his voice sounding hollow.
You're not mine. You will never be mine. I can't keep doing this to you, knowing that tomorrow you'll come back to him again.
His words were like a blow, but Zuri understood their truthfulness. She always knew it couldn't last forever. Their relationship was like sand that slips through your fingers, no matter how much you try to hold it. But every time she tried to let go, she came back, as if possessed by this passion that burned her from the inside out.
I can't,
she whispered, feeling her voice break. But Lumu had already taken a step back, his face filled with determination.
We need to stop before it gets worse.
He turned, looking away.
You don't belong to me, Zuri, and I don't want to ruin your life.
She wanted to protest, to tell him that her life was already ruined, that she had nothing left but these moments they spent together. But she knew that words wouldn't change anything. Everything was too deep. The cracks in her life have long been bottomless chasms. The silence between them became heavy and unbearable. Lumu looked at her one last time, as if saying goodbye, and then slowly walked to the door, leaving her alone. She watched his figure disappear into the darkness, and only then realized that this was really the end. Silence descended on the house like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The air was thick and viscous, and there seemed to be a smell of something inevitably terrible in it. Jabari sat at his massive wooden desk in his office, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface. He was always in control of himself. He has always been a man who keeps his emotions in check, not allowing them to control his actions. But not. Today was different. Today, his pride was destroyed. Today, his world has been turned upside down. The news that his wife, his Zuri, who had been faithful and submissive to him all her life, dared to cheat on him, was like a stab in the back. But it wasn't even the fact of cheating that infuriated him the most. It was the ease with which she did it, as if his existence no longer mattered. She didn't just change him. She betrayed him, threw away his pride like an unnecessary thing. Jabari has always been a man who knew his place in the world. He was respected, successful, feared, and respected. Zuri has always been something of a precious trophy for him. A beautiful, obedient, ideal wife who complemented his image like a beautiful accessory. But now that she had gone against him, when she had chosen someone else, the whole illusion had shattered. The evening silence was broken by barely audible footsteps. Jabari raised his head and saw her Zuri. She stood in the doorway of the office, her face calm, but her eyes betrayed anxiety. He felt his anger flare up even more. She didn't know that he had already found out everything. I didn't know that her every move was under surveillance. His voice sounded calm, but there was a threat in that calmness. Jabari always said that when he was going to strike a blow that would leave a mark forever. Zuri felt a chill run down her spine. She froze for a moment, feeling that something was wrong. Her gut instinct, which never failed, screamed at her about the danger. But she took a step forward.
I was late.
She replied calmly, trying not to show her excitement.
Might wheeze talking to a friend.
Fly, simple, but crude. It's too banal not to be seen through. And Jabari knew it. He was sitting at the table, staring at her, studying her face, her movements. He had always been a good observer, and now her every gesture was like an open book to him.
A friend?
His voice was cold.
The one you're meeting at Luma's house?
Zuri froze abruptly. My heart stopped for a moment. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to know everything already. Panic flared up inside her, but outwardly she maintained an appearance of calm. She'd lived in this marriage for too long, had watched Jabari for too long not to understand how to behave in such moments.
You're confusing something, Jabari.
She tried to sound confident, but her voice sounded cracked.
Am I confusing you?
His voice was quieter, but there was a threat in that tone. He got up from his chair and walked over to her. His every move was deliberate, like a predator that had already chosen its prey.
Do you think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? Do you think I'm blind? Stupid? You and this one. The moon.
Her lover's name sounded like a shot. Zuri felt her breathing falter, but she didn't back down. She knew that confessing wouldn't help her now. Only denial, only a lie can save her. Her voice was firm, but she couldn't hide the trembling in her hands. Jabari came closer, his face just inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin. This was the moment when he was especially terrifying, when his face was calm, but his eyes were burning with rage.
You know what I'm talking about, Zuri? You know very well. Did you think you could hide it from me? Did you think I'd never find out?
He grabbed her shoulder with such force that Zuri screamed in pain. His fingers dug into her skin, leaving marks that would remind her of his rage for a long time. She tried to pull away, but Jabari was too strong.
How long did it last?
His voice was low, but there was a threat in it.
Mustangs, how long have you been dating him behind my back?
Zuri was silent. She knew that any word could only make her situation worse. But silence won. Jabari released his hand and walked away. His face remained calm, but a storm was raging inside him. He went to the window and stood for a moment, staring at the night sky. Then he spoke, his voice cold and distant.
Do you know what I can do to you, Zuri?
His words sounded as if he had already made a decision, and it was final.
I could just kick you out on the street. I could have made you suffer for years, like you made me suffer.
He turned to her, his face full of hatred, which he had hidden behind a mask of indifference for too long. But now that mask has come off.
But that would be too easy, too merciful for you.
Zuri stood frozen. She didn't know what to say. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst out of her chest. She felt the ground beneath her feet slipping away, her world crumbling. Jabari has always been a man who acted deliberately. He wasn't impulsive, but that made him even more dangerous. He approached her again, but without malice. His face changed. It became calm, even cold. He looked at her the way he would look at a broken thing that was no longer of any value to him.
I've made my decision,
he said, his voice as flat as a judge passing sentence.
You don't belong to me anymore. You're nothing to me anymore.
These words pierced Zuri like a knife. He spoke to her as if she was no longer his wife, as if she had turned into something useless, unnecessary. But the real pain came not from his words, but from what followed them.
You're leaving tomorrow?
He continued.
I've already arranged everything. You'll be picked up by a man who knows how to handle people like you.
Zuri felt her blood run cold. Zuri was standing in the middle of the desert. The hot wind beat mercilessly against her face, lifting grains of sand into the air that scratched her skin. The desert was endless, lifeless. Her new world was no less harsh. She couldn't remember how many days had passed since she was taken out of Jabari's house. Time has lost all meaning, turning into a continuous stream of heat, dust, and despair. The carriage in which she was brought to this new hell had long disappeared over the horizon. There was no trace of civilization around, only the sun, relentlessly scorching from above, and endless sand. She was somewhere on the edge of human life, far from everything she had ever known. It was like a place from another world, a wild and cruel reality where people came only to disappear. She was sold into slavery. At first, Zuri couldn't believe it. She, who until recently was the wife of a respected man, has now become a thing that can be traded like a commodity. Her body, her life, everything had been bought with money, and now she belonged to another Eto. This old, stern man, whom she hadn't even seen yet. The first time she heard his name, she was overcome with fear. Beko was known for his wealth and cruelty. He was lonely, old, and they say he had no relatives. The years had imprisoned him in his own world, and in this world everything belonged to him. From the land he lived on to the people who worked for him. Now Zuri is in his collection. She was to become part of his estate, to serve him until he decided to get rid of her, as easily as he had once gotten rid of other slaves. When she was brought to his house, she felt completely devastated for the first time. A large stone house stood in the center of a huge plantation, surrounded by high walls. Zuri immediately realized that the walls were there not only to protect, but also to hold. She felt trapped in this place, like a bird in a cage with no way out.
Here she is.
The old servant's voice broke into her thoughts as they entered the house.
Me? The master is waiting for you.
These words sounded cold, almost indifferent, as if everything that was happening was ordinary. To this man, she was just another woman who had been brought into Bako's service. Zuri didn't know how long she could take it all. Her thoughts went back to the moment when Jabari pronounced his sentence. Every time she remembered his icy words, she felt the pain return with renewed vigor. When Zuri first saw Bako, her heart stopped. Standing in front of her was a man who looked like he had lived for thousands of years. His face was deeply lined, his eyes were hidden in shadow, and it seemed that they had seen too much for anything else to arouse their keen interest. He was sitting in a large armchair by the fireplace, and the fire crackling in the fireplace played on his grey hair, giving him an almost mythical appearance. He was not like those old men who slowly die in their beds. There was something different about him, something. Bako stared at her in silence. He didn't say a word when the servant led her to a chair. His eyes studied her as if assessing the product. She couldn't figure out what he was thinking, and that scared her the most. This man was a mystery to her that she didn't want to solve.
You belong to me now.
Bako said after a long pause, his voice low but firm as an order. Those words pierced her like the lash of a whip. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Her pride was crushed, as were all her dreams of freedom. She was broken, and this man in front of her knew it. He was the one who held her life in his hands.
You will do as I say.
Bako continued, his voice unchanged.
Otherwise, I'll get rid of you as easily as I got you.
Zuri was silent. What could she say? Her words didn't matter here. She wasn't herself anymore. She was turned into a thing, an object, something that could be used and thrown away. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them roll down her cheeks. She knew crying wouldn't help here. No one will hear her, no one will save her. From that moment, her new life began. A life that didn't belong to her. The first days at Bako's house were like a nightmare. Zuri had to perform the simplest, but most humiliating tasks. Bring food, clean rooms, obey every order. It was all unbearable. She felt like a prisoner with no freedom. Every morning she woke up thinking that it was just a dream, that everything would change soon. But every time she opened her eyes, reality hit her in the face with renewed force. Bako hardly spoke to her. He only gave orders through the servants, and that made her life even more unbearable. He was a shadow to her, a threat that always hung over her, but never manifested itself directly. Sometimes she caught his gaze dark, heavy, devoid of any emotion, but there was something in those looks that made her heart skip a beat. It seemed to her that behind his cold facade, there was something more, something dangerous and unknown. She couldn't figure out what he wanted from her. Why did he buy it? For what? These questions tormented her, but there was no answer. Bako remained silent and detached, as if she were just a part of his home, nothing more. One night Zuri couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed for a long time, thinking about how her life might have turned out if she hadn't made that fatal mistake. Jabari was cruel, but this cruelty was predictable. Bako was like a dark abyss full of uncertainty. Zuri understood that this unknown scared her the most. Getting out of bed, she decided to go outside. The cool night air enveloped her skin, bringing temporary relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She wandered among the tall trees growing in the garden, trying to find peace in nature, but the silence around her was deceptive. A hurricane was raging inside her.
You're not sleeping.
Mabako's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. Zuri shuddered. Her heart stopped for a moment. She hadn't expected to see him here in the garden, especially at night. He was standing nearby, hidden in the shade of the trees, watching her like a predator watching its prey.
I'm sorry.
She whispered, not knowing what else to say. Bako stepped closer. His face was illuminated by the faint light of the moon, and at this moment he seemed even more mysterious. Zuri could feel the anxiety building inside her.
There's no need to apologize here.
His voice was quiet but firm.
You can wander around the garden if you want. This is not a prison.
His words sounded almost mocking. For Zuri, this house was a prison from which there was no way out, and they both knew it.
Why am I here?
She suddenly blurted out. Bako stopped, his gaze becoming even heavier. He was silent for a long time before answering.
You're here because I wanted you to be. Your mistakes brought you to me. But don't think I've forgotten who you are. I always remember.
These words sounded like a sentence. Bako was letting her know that her fate was sealed. She will never be able to escape from this place, and she will have to accept it. Echo did not immediately understand what was happening to him. In the beginning, it was something fleeting, barely noticeable. His usual order of things did not change. The days passed in monotonous bustle, working on a plantation, watching slaves, rare meetings with merchants, farming. But gradually something inside began to shift. It was as if a tiny crack had appeared in his carefully constructed life, which grew wider day by day, threatening to destroy everything that he had been building for so long. Zuri became this crack. At first, he thought her presence was just a temporary nuisance. He bought her not because he wanted to, but to punish her for her mistakes, for the weakness she showed in front of another man. She was just another object for him, another thing in his huge house, like a rare but broken vessel that someone had left in his possession. Baeko has never been a sentimental person. His life has taught him to be cruel and cold. He lost interest in the pleasures of life, replacing them with power and control. His every day was clearly planned, and his every action was carefully considered. There was no place for emotions in this world, but with the advent of Zuri, something has changed. She began to penetrate his thoughts like a fog, gradually filling the entire space. He didn't know when it started, but he soon realized that her image haunted him, not only during the day, but also at night. At first, he was angry with himself for this. He tried to ignore her, did his best to avoid meeting her, but it didn't help. Even when she was far away, he could still feel her presence, her every movement, her every step. All this became a source of a strange, almost painful sensation for him. He began to notice how she walked around the house, how her hair fluttered in the wind, how she carefully touched objects, as if afraid of breaking something. She moved quietly, like a ghost, but her presence was tangible, as if it had taken over every corner of his house. Echo thought that all this would pass. He was sure that in time he would forget about her, that these thoughts about her would disappear the same way they appeared. But every day they became stronger and more intrusive. He found himself watching her from afar, watching her every move, peering into her face, into her eyes. And the more he looked at her, the more he realized that she had become more than just a slave to him. Eto didn't know how it happened, but one day, watching her, he realized he no longer sees in her the broken man he once bought. Now she seemed to him not an object, not a thing, but a living being full of feelings and emotions. This discovery baffled him. He had never thought of women like that. To him, they were always something like jewelry, something that could be possessed and controlled. But Zuri was different. He began to notice details that he would never have noticed before. The way her lips tighten when she thinks about something important. The way her eyes narrow slightly when she looks at the sunset. The way she holds the cup of water, carefully, as if afraid to drop it. These little things began to worry him, to bother his mind. Echo tried to fight it. He convinced himself that this was just a temporary clouding of his mind, that he needed to focus on business, on the plantation, on power. But the more he tried, the stronger became his desire to be with her, to look at her. He began to find reasons to be in the places where Zuri was. Sometimes these were minor reasons: to check the work of the servants, to inspect the garden, to make sure that everything was in order. But in fact, he was attracted to her, and he couldn't handle it. She became something of an obsession for him. Baeko knew that this was not right, that such feelings were a weakness that he could not afford. But every time he saw her, something broke inside. He couldn't look away anymore, couldn't ignore what was going on inside him. Sometimes at night he would wake up and lie in the dark, listening to the silence of the house. He imagined her lying somewhere in her corner, alone, as lonely as he was. These thoughts tormented him. Baeko has never been a person who felt lonely. He always believed that loneliness was his choice, his strength. But now that Zuri had appeared in his life, he began to doubt it. Her presence made his loneliness more obvious, more painful. One day, as the sun was setting, Baeko stood at the window and looked out at the garden. He saw Zuri in the distance. She stood among the trees, her dress fluttering in the wind, her hair glistening in the last rays of the sun. She didn't notice him. He watched her, as always, from afar, not daring to come closer. At that moment, a strange feeling came over him. He realized that he no longer saw her as his slave. Now she seemed like something more to him, something he couldn't control. She was a mystery to him that he couldn't solve, and it scared him. Bako was a man of power, a man of control. But now, looking at Zuri, he felt like he was losing control of himself. He stood there for a long time, watching her, not daring to take a step forward. He knew that if he took this step, everything would change, but something inside him was pulling him towards her, making him feel something he'd never felt before. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, a feeling he couldn't understand. The following days, Bako began to notice changes in himself. He couldn't be the same anymore. His thoughts kept returning to Zuri. He became less cruel to the slaves, less demanding of the servants. He tried to hide these changes, but those who worked with him began to notice that something in his behavior had changed. Bako was still trying to fight with himself. He knew that these feelings were weakness, and weakness could destroy him. But every day it became more difficult for him to deny the truth. He could no longer ignore how he felt about Zuri. One night he couldn't stand it. He left his office and went to the garden where Zuri often walked. Moonlight illuminated the paths, and the leaves of the trees rustled in the wind. Bako walked slowly, almost unaware of where he was going. He stopped at a large oak tree, where he often saw her. She wasn't there, but his thoughts were on her. He leaned against a tree and closed his eyes. At that moment, he realized that he could no longer deny the obvious. He fell in love. He fell in love with Zuri, the woman he bought as a slave, the woman who was supposed to be nothing in his life. But now she has become everything. The thought struck him like lightning. He didn't know how to live with this feeling. He, Bako, an old, cruel man, fell in love. Zuri stood at the window, looking out at the dawn, which flooded the horizon with scarlet and gold hues. The house was quiet. Everyone was still asleep except for her. She had long lost the ability to find peace in her sleep. Every day, every night, she was haunted by something more than fatigue. She stood there motionless, as if she was waiting for something that was going to change her life. But nothing happened. The world around him was static, like a painting on a wall. She's not the same person she used to be for a long time. Once upon a time, Zuri was a woman with pride, with dreams. But now her life was like an endless void. First, Jabari destroyed her. His cold hatred, his desire to subdue her, she became his victim. And it seemed that everything she knew about herself disappeared the day he sold her to Bako. Even his name now caused her to have a complicated storm of feelings that she couldn't control. Zuri never thought that her life would take such a turn. When she first came to Bako's house, she was filled with fear and hatred. This old man was to her something like a living reminder of her enslavement, of how far she had fallen in her own eyes. She hated him, hated what he represented. The power that had trapped her in this house, wrapped around her like invisible chains. At first, Zuri struggled. She struggled with a sense of hopelessness, with despair, which approached her like darkness threatening to engulf her completely. She could not allow herself to break down. She knew that she had to fight for her freedom, for the opportunity to leave here, to escape from this old man who seemed to her so cruel and indifferent. But every day her resolve melted like snow under the scorching sun. Her new life has become something of a test. Bako hardly spoke to her, and there was a certain cruelty in that silence. He never physically punished her, never openly humiliated her, but his silent presence, his indifference to her feelings made it all the more unbearable. There were many servants in the house, but none of them noticed her real suffering. She was just one of many, and her presence didn't matter. She was a shadow in this huge and frightening house. However, over time, something began to change. Zuri began to notice that Bako was watching her more and more often. There was no longer the coldness in his gaze that she had seen in the early days. Now that she saw the way he was looking at her, a strange mixture of feelings arose in her: fear, curiosity, and then something else that she was afraid to name. She often wondered what kind of feelings had gripped her. Was she really starting to get attached to him? The question seemed absurd to her, and whenever it popped into her head, she immediately pushed it away. But every day, this feeling became more pronounced. Bako was old, but there was something in his gaze that made her think of him as a man. She couldn't explain it, because he had never been desirable to her. and certainly wasn't someone she could love. Zuri understood that this internal conflict was destroying her. On the one hand, she hated Bako for what he represented, for power, for slavery, for being her master. But on the other hand, she saw something in his eyes that she didn't see in other men. She began to realize that she was more than just a slave to him. He was looking at her with a kind of strange respect, with a tenderness that was so unexpected that she couldn't figure out how to react to it. One day, on one of those quiet evenings, she felt his gaze on her again. He stood in the doorway watching her, but didn't say a word. This silence was no longer cruel. It became almost comforting for her. There was a hidden power in his silence that she began to feel on herself. He no longer looked at her as property. There was something more in his gaze now, and it scared her even more. But at some point, her fear began to turn into something else. Her feelings for Bayako have changed. She couldn't figure out how it happened, but now that he was around, she no longer felt the hatred that she had before. Now she felt a strange, almost painful attraction. It was something she couldn't name, but it was growing in her every day. Zuri was trapped between two worlds. On the one hand, she still wanted to escape, wanted to be free from this house, from Bako, from everything that connected her with the past. But on the other hand, she felt that her life here in this house had changed. Bako was no longer just an old man who bought her. Now he was something more, something she couldn't ignore. This struggle within her was becoming more and more desperate. She knew that if she stayed here, she would never be truly free. But now, looking at Bako, she could no longer confidently say that she wanted to leave. She could no longer ignore the fact that her life here had changed, and it had changed with her. Zuri spent many nights thinking about what to do next. Her mind was racing between running away and staying. But every time she imagined life outside this house, she was seized with fear. What awaits her there? In a world that has long been a stranger to her, she was no longer the woman she once was. She was different now, and the world outside this house was different too. Bako has changed too. She saw it in his every move, in his every look. He was no longer the old man who had bought her as a commodity. Now he was looking at her with such tenderness and longing that she could no longer pretend not to notice it. And what was even more frightening, she felt that her own feelings had changed too. She could no longer see him as just her master. She saw in him a man who was willing to give up everything for her. But this only intensified her inner struggle. Zuri couldn't figure out what was the right choice for her. She knew that if she stayed here, she would live in the shadow of the past, the shadow of her enslavement. But at the same time, life outside this house scared her even more. She no longer knew what was waiting for her there, outside the walls of this house, and that scared her the most. Every day brought new thoughts, new doubts. Zuri no longer knew what was right for her, to escape from Bako and try to regain her freedom, or to stay here, accept the life that she had already begun to consider her own. These thoughts tore her apart, but the decision still did not come. The day started the same way as any other. A light morning mist enveloped the land, hiding the plantation and Bako's house in a ghostly haze. Zuri sat by the window, as she did every morning, looking out at the awakening world. But this day something was different. She could feel it in the air, as if she was expecting something inevitable, something impending that was going to radically change her life. Her heart was pounding with anxiety, although she couldn't say exactly why. Bako, as always, was busy with his own affairs. Over the past few months, he had become more than just a master to her. He was a figure who filled her life, imposed his thoughts, his feelings on her. Zuri was still struggling with this internal struggle, not knowing what to do with her feelings for Bako. But today, something dark and heavy was pressing on her mind. It all started with the appearance of dust on the horizon. Zuri noticed it first, a thin strip lifted by the wind, which was moving towards the house. At first, she thought they were just workers returning from the fields, but something in her heart told her that this was not. The wind picked up, and after a while she could see the carriage slowly approaching. Her hands trembled. She felt something cold envelop her body. This day seemed to her a portent of trouble. She didn't need to see who was sitting in that carriage to know it was Jabari. Zuri felt her blood run cold. She thought that the past was left behind, that Jabari had forgotten about her as an unnecessary thing. But now he was coming back, like a ghost, to break into her life again. Her thoughts were racing in chaos. Why was he here? What does he want? She knew this wasn't going to be an easy meeting. His return did not bode well. The carriage stopped at the gate, and Zuri froze. She couldn't watch as Jabari came out of her, his figure tall, commanding as before. He was the same as she remembered him, cold, stern, with an impenetrable gaze. The years seemed to have left him untouched, and his presence here in Bayako's territory seemed inappropriate and terrifying to her. She couldn't turn away from the window, watching Jabari walk across the courtyard, his confident footsteps sounding in the silence of the morning. Zuri's heart sank with fear and despair. All her feelings for this man were stirred up again. All those emotions that she thought she had suppressed long ago returned with renewed vigor. Everything was bursting at the seams inside her. Jabari came to return what he considered his own. He has never been a man who forgives betrayal. His pride was hurt, and Zuri knew he wouldn't stop until he got his way. She was not just a woman to him. She was a symbol of his power, his control. And now he's come to get her back. Zuri realized that her time for reflection had come to an end. Now she was faced with a choice on which her whole future life depended. She knew Jabari wouldn't leave here just like that. He would do anything to possess her again, to make her return to his world, where she'd always been only a shadow, only an object of his power. But now there was a Bako in her life, a man who looked at her differently than any other man. Her mind was racing in chaos, and her heart was beating faster. She had to make a choice. Jabari will offer her a return to the past, to a life she hated, but which was familiar to her. He was confident in his power over her. He knew that her future was in his hands, but staying with Bako meant something else. It was a choice not only for herself, but also for her freedom, for the right to a life that belonged to her. She knew that Bako would not fight for her. His pride was different. He loved her in a different way, without violence and control. He was old, but there was a power in his heart that Zuri now respected. She saw respect in his eyes, not attraction to property. But could she stay with him, knowing that her future was still tied to a past that would never let her go completely? Jabari entered the house, his footsteps echoing in the corridors. Zuri froze, listening to him approach. Her heart skipped a beat. The moment of truth has arrived. Her body was paralyzed, but her mind was working at its limit. She knew that if she didn't make a decision now, everything would be decided for her. She would have to return to Jabari, to a life that was full of pain, to a world where she was deprived of her freedom. But staying here with Bako meant accepting another reality, a reality where her freedom was still limited, but now her fate was in her hands. Every minute dragged on endlessly. Zuri stood at the crossroads of her life, her mind overloaded with thoughts. Her past haunted her, but her future remained uncertain. What should I choose? To stay in the past, with the man who broke her, or to accept a future in which there was another, more complicated, but warm connection? Jabari was already close, his footsteps getting louder. This was the moment Zuri had been dreading. She knew that if she allowed him to enter her life again, there would be no turning back. And in that moment she realized that, despite all her fears, her decision was right. She was no longer the kind of woman Jabari could control. She's changed. Both this house and Bako have changed her. She didn't know how to explain it to Bako himself, but she knew she wouldn't go back to Jabari. Zuri turned to the window, looking out at the dying light of the morning, which reminded her that a new day brings not only new challenges, but also new hope. She chose to stay.